Good luck for your section today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much for joining our special workshop training today. Then the activities belonging to the third Asian Conference on Business and Economics Study on virtual platform on Zoom. So before starting the program today, so I would like to say thank you. So to three groups of people. So who is like three groups, I would like to say thank you. The first group is, I would like to say thank you for every frontline health workers and everyone that supports for Vietnam to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. I think they are superheroes to keep us safe and we can stay at home to listen to the conference today. So I just want to say the frontline health worker that they did an amazing good job. Then please do take care of yourself and also your beloved family during this time. The second one I would like to say thank you today is the special guest from US and also our partner. So I would like to say thank Professor Nguyễn Phong, the US Council Chairman. I also would like to say thank you, Professor Sử Đình Thành, US President, and also thank you, Dr. Bùi Quang Hùng, the US Vice President. Thank you very much for your participation today. This is our valuation encouragement for the workshop training today. Then the third person I would like to say thank is the partner, our partner related to Lincoln University with Dr. Nguyễn and Khánh Hoàng also joining with us. Then is a very, very important person that I want to highlight to say thank you today is the Professor Wolfgang. He also joining the workshop today as the keynote speaker to provide the interesting topic related to cytometrics and also like the new methodology related to evaluate the research pipeline and also the excellent research pipeline. Then I would like to explain the meaning of the workshop because the conference is not the place that we join to disseminate our research outcome, but also the place that you can come and learn and also to get knowledge. That the reason why we organize the workshop, that every Asian researchers, they can learn something from the advanced researchers in the world. So this is like the meaning of the workshop today. Then I don't let you wait more. So I would like to invite Dr. Khánh Hoàng from Lincoln University. So you can moderate, introduce the guest speaker, and also manage the next section. Thank you.
Khánh Hoàng, please open your micro.
Yeah, right. Hello, everyone. This is my pleasure to be the moderators of this special training sessions at the ACBES conference. Let me introduce about the keynote speakers. That is Professors Wolfgang Glanzels, who is a full professor at the KU Leuven and director of the Center for R&D Monitoring. He is also the senior scientist at the Department of Science Policies and Scientometrics at the libraries of the Hungarian Academy of Science in Budapest. He studied mathematics in Budapest in Hungary. He holds a doctorate in mathematics in Oxford, Leuven University, Budapest, as well as his PhD in social science from the University Leiden in Netherlands. He worked about 20 years at the libraries of Hungarian Academies of Sciences, and he was Alexander von Humboldt Fellows for 2 years in Germany. Since 2002, he works for and live in Leuven, in Belgium. And the professors Wolfgang Glanzels is editor-in-chief of the International Journal Scientometrics, the academic editors of the Journals +1 and the Secretary Treasurer of the International Society for Scientometrics and Informatics, or we call ISSI. Wolfgang Lorenz is a co-authors and co-editors of several books and more than 300 publications in international journals and conference proceedings. He has published in probability theories and mathematical statistics, computer science, and various topics in the quantitative science studies. And in 1999, he received the International Direct the Solar Prize Award for outstanding contributions to the quantitative study of science. And today, he's going to present the topics about quantitative science study evaluations. The special topic is building reliable bibliometric indicators for measuring research performance. And let's welcome Professor Wolfgang Lorenz.
So thank you very much for introducing me, and good afternoon to everybody. It's really a pleasure to speak to you today, and I thank you very much for this invitation. So I have a lot of material prepared for you because it's quite a complex issue to talk about how to apply or how to conduct quantitative science studies in an evaluative context. I would also like to give you some guidelines in building and applying bibliometric indicators, research output, and so forth. So I will share my screen first. Just a moment. I think it should be like this. Can you see it?
Yes, of course.
Okay, that's fine. So first I give an overview. I start with a prologue where I simply explain that the turn that bibliometrics and scientometrics has taken during the last decades. And then I start actually with my topic by looking at step by step, what are the preconditions to have a good analysis, a good study of scientific activities at different levels of aggregation. So I start up with the appropriateness of data sources to be used in bibliometrics. I do not know in how far you are familiar with bibliometrics and scientometrics. Of course, I will explain to you what is covered by these activities, by this research topic. And then I will also focus on the quality and cleanness of data. Something about the different application levels like granularity and aggregation level, and the new trends in scientometrics, namely the impact beyond scholarly communication. So I give a short introduction first, and the prologue from information to evaluation. And I go back to Eugene Garfield. I do not know if you know Eugene Garfield. He was chairman of the Institute for Scientific Information and started up in the early 60s to develop a science citation index. That was the first multidisciplinary database in the world. And even today, the derivatives of these and further developments of this citation database are still in use, and one of the main sources, along with Scopus, Elsevier, and Dimensions, for the evaluation activity and research communication. So this database was developed for the advanced retrieval of information and also for scientific information. So it has not been created for bibliometrics at all. It was not really designed for that, but it has very soon become a common tool in bibliometric studies. And Jean Garfield still said some years ago that the SCI was originally created either to conduct quantitative studies, calculate impact factors nor to facilitate the study of history of science. So he called this paper at that time, From Information Retrieval to Scientometrics, is a dog still wagging its tail, because he found that sometimes in studies the tail is wagging the dog. So this was not his intention. So we have to see that there was a big turn actually starting up in the 50s, but mainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it all began practically with the huge strategic scientific research programs in the context of the Cold War. I just remind you the Space to the Moon, for instance, in the 60s, which consumed a lot of money for research to facilitate this huge endeavor. And if I do not know, I still remember, so when the Americans really started their first space craft to the moon successfully, it was really, so you have to understand at that time it was a big multi-interdisciplinary endeavor. So scientists from all to facilitate this project, because physicists were involved, mathematicians, engineers, of course, but even scientists from the life sciences, because people were carried by the spacecraft, and they had to check the influence on lacking gravity and so on. So it was really from scientists from all fields of science were involved in such huge project. It was not the only projects of this in this strategic context. So research consumed a lot of money, and of course people wanted to know what is done with all this money, tax money that is spent on research. And there was a so-called indicator movement in the 60s, 70s by the National Science Board in the US, and it still exists. So the reports are still published every 2 years. It's just to report what is published, what is done in terms of research. And that was a certain turn in scientometrics, not only to inform people about what's going on in research, but also to evaluate, so to speak, the research output. And that means that scientometrics evolved from a subdiscipline of library and information science to an instrument for evaluation and benchmarking. So there are some papers on that where we have a bit analyzed that. And that means that also several scientometrics tools that has been developed in the 60s became used in the context for which they were never designed. Like, for instance, you might know the impact factor. Huh? The impact factor that is published along with the Web of Science or the Science Citation Index in the earlier versions, in a product that is published along with the Web of Science. It's a journal citation report, and this is a scientific journal measure. And it was designed to create create the environment to select new journals for the database, or maybe a performance matter for the journal, but later on it has been directly used for evaluation, and this was a problematic issue. I come back to that later. So due to the dynamics of evolution, the focus was shifted away from macro studies. Macro study, what is a macro study? Is a study on the national level, for instance, towards meso and micro studies. That means to university institutional level. Micro means research teams, individual scientists of both actors and topics. Macro means also all science combined, all science fields combined. Meso might be major fields, and micro studies are focused on particular research topics, small research topics. Okay. So more recently, the evaluation of research teams and individual scientists has become a central issue in services based on bibliometric data, and this is going on at different levels. For instance, universities are using bibliometrics to evaluate their research departments or individual scientists, but also at the national level, there are many governmental institutions, administrations that are using bibliometrics to evaluate research done in their country at different levels of aggregations, and also to distribute funding to universities, for instance, as it is done in Belgium, in Flanders. In my institute, we are providing data for this purpose. So besides information science and sociology of science, science policy became the third driving force in the evolution of scientometrics. So science policy is a powerful entity to support, to fund bibliometric studies and bibliometric that's also one of the backgrounds of my presentation. So as far if you inform scientists on what is going on in their field, the demand on so to speak, on the completeness and the correctness is high, but not so high. But if it comes to evaluation, so you need really a complete and an error-free data source to do so. Just let me tell you the following. There was a service by SCI, the Science Citation Index in Philadelphia by SCI based. It was called ASCA. It was an alerting service for science, the recent publications, and it was a weekly service. So you could ask for this information. So each scientist had to pay a subscription, and then you got a weekly information list on what is going on in your field. It was based also on some bibliometrics. So if you received a list of, for instance, 100 papers, you were an expert, and if it was incomplete, it was not so bad, it was useful, you got some information on it. And if it contained some false positives, yeah, you could simply filter out it because you're an expert. It was useful anyway. But if you use the same list to evaluate scientists for their promotion, for instance, that's a nightmare. So you need much more correctness and much more completeness of the information that is used in an evaluative context, because otherwise you cause a lot of crucial errors. And Henk Moot from the Netherlands raised the question of errors, namely of what is an acceptable error rate in the assessment process. So everything is a bit error prone, but it's, of course, the aim is to eliminate errors or to minimize errors so that the assessment is still valid. Okay. So as a rule of experience, you have also to assume that you have to spend to 80% on data processing, cleaning, and indicator testing if you use bibliometrics in an evaluative context. You start up with data collecting, with data retrieval, with cleaning data, processing data, and you have to test your results, of course. And this is maybe 80% of the time we spend on, and only 20% is practically the scientometric work, is writing reports, is doing that stuff. So, and I summarize the way of bibliographic data to appropriate bibliometric indicators for measuring research performance is a long and stony road. So that was just an introduction to sketch the background. Now I come a bit to the real stuff, namely to using data from bibliographic databases to process data, to turn them into figures, so to speak, to use bibliometric tools and to apply bibliometric tools. So the basic demands on bibliographic databases for possible bibliometric use are the following. Yeah? So indicators can only be as good as the underlying data sources allow. That's clear. If the databases are incomplete, so you cannot correct it afterwards by building indicators. It's not, you are not able to compensate for that. So the data sources must provide a basis for global comparisons, benchmarking exercises. So practically for bibliometrics, you can use all kinds of publication lists on the reports, but this is then a local issue. It's a local story. If you would like really to have a good assessment, you have to compare. For instance, you would like to compare the research activity of your department, for instance, with that of others. Otherwise, you can count some publications and citations of publications in your department, and then so what? So you need a certain baseline to say, is it how to compare this activity, how to compare the citation impact, how to compare the collaboration of your department with that of others. Is it in line with the standard or not, for instance? So you need a global database or at least a larger database covering not only a local environment, so to speak. The data sources must allow replicability of results at any time. So if you provide a study and anybody is looking at the outcomes of the study, this person must be able to replicate the results using the same data, using the same methodology, the same indicators, and the person must come up with the same results as you have done. So that's very important because bibliometrics is a scientific discipline. Okay, and scientific disciplines are characterized by replicability of results. So if you have an experiment, you redo the experiment under the same conditions, you come to the same results. Okay, so, and this applies to bibliometrics as well. The appropriateness of databases for bibliometric use includes data basic issues as. So you need subject coverage. So all subjects must be covered. So you can, of course, use databases, specific databases like Medline, like that's chemical abstracts or mathematical reviews, for instance, but then it's restricted to specific fields. And it might be good for at lower levels of aggregation. If you look at the activities of special departments, the activity is devoted to these special fields, you can use these databases. But on larger or higher levels of aggregation, you certainly need a multidisciplinary database with a coverage of all fields that are covered in the activities or by the activities of multidisciplinary university, and most universities are multidisciplinary today. You need a source coverage, of course. Once a journal or proceedings cover, all the papers must be covered because otherwise the results are not complete. You need the availability of necessary information. You need information about all the co-authors, the abstracts, references, addresses. So the database must provide all the information you need for your job. Also, the completeness must be there. So still in the 70s, 80s, some databases only provided or recorded the first author or the corresponding author and only the corresponding address. At that time, it was sufficient because what was the aim of the database? You could retrieve your information and then you could contact the corresponding author and ask for a reprint, for instance. That was practically the idea behind the structure of the database. But nowadays it's not sufficient. If you don't have information about all authors, all addresses, you cannot conduct any study on co-authorship and research collaboration between different authors, between different institutions or countries. And of course, very important nowadays, you need an author affiliation link in order to link authors to affiliations. In the paper, you have always this link. If you look at a scientific paper, if you look, be it a journal or proceedings, then you have the link between the author and the affiliation. But in the databases, very often this was not available. And that is really a problem if you go down to lower levels of aggregation to identify authors and the institutions. We have further criteria concerns. For instance, publication type. So you have to be, a publication type can be a journal, a book, a proceedings, a monography, or book chapter. And within these, you have to distinguish between document type, research article, review, letter, editorial, for instance, or meeting abstract. This is very important because in terms of scholarly communication, all these document types and publication types have their own rules. For instance, in bibliometrics, only research article, review, letter, and notes are important because meeting abstracts do not convey this information that is needed to evaluate things because it's just a summary. And usually the paper itself is published elsewhere in the proceedings or in another journal. Okay, the selection criteria are important in terms of journals. Which journals are selected and covered by the database? Which kind of books? Which kind of proceedings? And this is also an issue sometimes. If you look at the conference series, you wonder why only some of the conferences in the series are covered and recorded by the database, and why others, why not? And of course, you have redundancy of information through translation, different publication types, and similar documents. A paper might be published in the proceedings in a extended version, and then later on in a journal. So that's redundant information. It's not exactly the same paper then, but it's very similar. So that's for the database. Now I come to the quality of cleanness of data. So of course, if you have a retrieval and you download your data from the database, you are confronted with the content and the structure of the downloaded data and the metadata. And you will find that the quality of the data is not always optimum. So the quality might be affected by different actors, so to speak, in this process, because the authors of the publications might be responsible for the quality. If you have a look at the scientific paper or a book or proceedings whatsoever, you will see that the authors make many mistakes. Some typical mistakes are in the reference list, which are incomplete. Papers are cited in the text but not appear in the reference list, or vice versa. There are errors in the cited references. There are errors in the author names themselves. They make errors in their own names or in the affiliation. Of course, the editors of the journals may modify information and truncate things. They modify references, for instance, remove information, modify affiliation, standardize them, and errors may occur. The database producer is also responsible for the quality. They cannot add any information that is left out by editors and others, but they can they usually modify, like Web of Science is modifying address information, for instance, and they make errors, of course. And of course, you as a user of the database might also make errors. Okay, so authors themselves are responsible for many errors, including names, references, addresses, titles as well. Okay, so and these are various misspellings, incomplete information, erroneous data. So typical errors caused by database producers, I mentioned already, is incorrect assignment, also the author IDs. So there is an issue. There are two types of author IDs. It's like ORCID, you know, ORCID, for instance, where you can register yourself. And also in Web of Science, you have to register yourself. In Scopus, it's a bit different. The database is giving you an author ID. The same applies to mathematical reviews. And of course, the author identification in the database is not always unique. So in Scopus, there was a time where I had 13 different identities. I could reduce them to 2. And the other way around, if you define your ID yourself, if you register, for instance, for ORCID or for Web of Science, you have also regularly to update it in Web of Science, because if new papers are recorded or indexed, you have published, you have also to assign them to your researcher ID. That's the point. A misspelled incorrect document identifiers like DOI, that's very frequent in almost all databases. I mentioned already address modification and incomplete information. That's quite critical. It's on funding information. So all papers, not all papers, many papers contain funding information. This is recorded, but not always correctly and not always, and sometimes it's missed. Okay. So data therefore need careful cleaning, but many errors can practically not be corrected on a large scale, because if they are missing, it's very hard to correct that. At a low level, you can do that by matching with other databases, by matching with CV information, for instance. You can still do that. It requires a lot of time, but it's really necessary. Okay. So if we start up working with data, So we start up usually with a data retrieval and subject delineation. So for instance, if you have in department or with a certain research activity, on one hand, you can ask for a publication list. That's one issue. On the other hand, of course, you can also download based on the institutional information from the database. You can match the two information to have a better coverage. Now, that's one point, but you are very fine with the publication list and matching them into the database. That's fine on the one hand. On the other hand, you need a kind of benchmarking. You need also to compare with the activity of other institutions where you don't have available this information. So you need to delineate their activity and to retrieve data on a certain topic. So that means a sufficiently fine-grained intellectual subject classification scheme can help to define a broader scope within an actual subject can be delineated. You can, for instance, search within a larger context. For instance, if you look at a certain topic within cardiology, so you just focus on cardiology and search within that. Or the same applies to other topics as well. If you have a broader scope, a broader science field, you can search locally within this field. So, but preset disciplines and topics usually result in noise. You have also, if you download, you can use, for instance, information based on subject categories in Web of Science or in research areas of Web of Science. But if you use them, you very often obtain or get a lot of noise, which is too large to obtain acceptable coverage with both high precision and recall. So also using scientific journals, you have some core journals that are fully devoted to a certain topic can be used, but then usually they are too coarse for subject delineation because they also publish papers on other topics. And you might know the so-called Bradford's law. Bradford has published this paper in the 30s, 1935, and it's still valid. And I have a very good example for that I will share with you. That's actually also 34, excuse me, not 35. He said that if scientific journals are arranged in order of decreasing productivity on a given subject or topic, they may be divided into a nucleus of journals more particularly devoted to the subject and several groups or zones containing the same number of articles as the nucleus, when the number of periodicals in the nucleus and the succeeding zones will form a geometric series, 1 to b to 1 b square, b cube, and so forth, where b is the Bradford, so-called Bradford constant. And this is an example from a recent example from published in 2006, actually, on tetrachlorodibenzodioxane literature. And here you see how nicely it's, of course, it's a logarithmic scale. So the series becomes then a linear function, so to speak. Here you have, here you see that the journal rank is a logarithmic scale, and that is a cumulative number of articles in a normal scale. So you see really this distribution over journals on this topic. So that's here the nucleus on the left-hand side, and this is the accumulation of journals that are devoted also to other topics. And that makes it quite difficult to research or to search relevant literature in this part. Here, you can use the core journals really as they are devoted on this topic. For instance, Scientometrics, the journal Scientometrics I'm the editor-in-chief of, is really fully devoted to Scientometrics. If you would like to collect literature on Scientometrics, you can take this journal. You can also take the Journal of Informatics. It's fully devoted. Research Evaluation is also devoted to research evaluation, and so on. The QSS, the new journal edited by Ludo Waldmann, you can use them as they are completely covering the literature on Scientometrics. You can trust it, You don't have to filter out, you can use them all. But if you look at already at the Journal of Information Science, for instance, or JSIS, the Journal of the Association on Information Science and Technology, you have already to filter out. They are here located, so to speak, in this area, because not of all of the papers published there are relevant on scientometrics. Huh? And if you do it in the framework of evaluation, then you have to keep in mind that an institute, a department, for instance, might have other activities. But if you have to distinguish between literature that is not relevant here, indicated in blue, and the relevant one in red, and you have something here around in pink, which might be relevant, but you have to decide, or the commissioner of the study has to decide if this literature should be considered or not. Is it still relevant for the activity of the department, for instance, or the institute, or is it not relevant? So you can adjust you have to adjust your retrieval, so to speak, your subject delineation to the requirements of the study you have to provide. So the scope of the study decides whether document in the red or the purple circle are used for the bibliometric analysis or not. And here, and that has become in field on its own. Actually, it has been developed by Michel Ziet and Bascular, by me as well and my colleagues, by Philip Meyer and Kabanak. This is called bibliometrics aided retrieval. So it's not only that you have a retrieval in your database, that you formulate a search strategy based on a text, based on journals, for instance, or based on other aspects. You can also use metrics to fine-tune your retrieval. And this happens in the following way. So I just mentioned again, you should, or maybe you know the two terms, precision and recall. Precision refers to the fraction of relevant documents in the retrieved set. So you retrieve a data set and then you say, these documents, that is the percentage of documents that are relevant and that is not relevant. That's a typical type 1 error, false positives, if they are not relevant. Recall is the other way around, it's a bit more tricky. It refers to the fraction of retrieved relevant documents in respect to the total number of relevant documents in the database, but you usually don't know how many relevant papers are recorded or indexed in the database. That's a type 2 error representative, the false negative. That means these the relevant papers that are not covered by the retrieval. So, which is rather difficult to estimate. So what you can do, you start up with the so-called unconditional set. You really focus on, for instance, on the core journals or on a retrieval, a strategy where you see that all collected or retrieved documents are relevant. For instance, as I mentioned, if you would like to cover the field of scientometrics, you can use the journal scientometrics, the 4 journals I mentioned actually. You can also search for text where you find bibliographic coupling or co-citation analysis or scientometric, bibliometric or something like that. And you can be sure that the papers you will retrieve will be relevant. You can have larger sets, for instance, include journals like JSIS, I mentioned, or Journal of Information Science, or Information Processing and Management, or Journal of Documentation. But not all the papers are relevant for bibliometrics. But what you can do, you can define a condition. And here, bibliometrics come into the picture. You look, for instance, for citation links in the larger set, in the second set, with the core set. Huh? Bibliographic coupling, co-citation, direct citation links. Then you see, okay, documents in the second larger, not necessarily fully relevant data set that are strongly linked with the first set are certainly dealing with the topic in question, with bibliometrics, for instance, in that case. Huh? And here you can combine, you obtain a final set if you have the core set, the seed in the beginning, and the extended but filtered set. Then you get a combination of the two, which gives you the final set. And this is called bibliometrics aided retrieval because you start up with a high precision, low recall. you add a low precision, high recall, and you get a high precision, high recall. And that's actually what you want to obtain. And that can be the basis for your study on the topic, a bibliometric study on the topic you have retrieved, like, for instance, cytometrics, as I mentioned here by example. Okay, you can, of course, conduct a cytometric study on cytometric literature. It's done. So the main fields of applications are interdisciplinary journals. So literature is spread over a plethora of specific, generally multidisciplinary journals. So interdisciplinarity has become a very important issue. Huh? So, and it's very hard to retrieve, to delineate interdisciplinary fields because they are connecting different science fields. I give you some examples. If you look at a typical synthetic, I call it synthetic interdisciplinary field like biomedical engineering, huh? Which brings together people from the life sciences, from clinical medicine, with engineers, with physicists, for instance. Huh? So that means it's very difficult to use subject categories to cover this field. You really need a well-designed retrieval strategy to collect the literature on that. Okay. Also, new emerging topics that are not fully established. Huh? Here you need some more sophisticated things. You cannot simply apply traditional retrieval strategies. And of course, for benchmarking exercises, so where research units might have a special research and publication profiles, which is often determined by the PIs, by the principal investigators and their own activities. They also bring some other activities into the main scope of these units or departments, for instance. So now we say we have retrieved a data set we can use that's originated from a proper database. We have cleaned the data. We have corrected errors as far as possible. Now we have a data set available for a study. Okay, now we have to apply a methodology, how to do some assessment, how to calculate indicators, how to build and calculate indicators to be applied to the data set we have retrieved, we have cleaned and processed to the step that we can apply indicators. So, of course, on the conceptual part, indicator designers should notably avoid several things. So, of course, you need you have to avoid comparing apples with oranges. Huh? So, for instance, the concept already you might have. There's no point in comparing a medical school with a business school, for instance. Huh? They have activity on completely different topics, huh? Completely different fields. So there's also no point in comparing, for instance, different, just comparing activity with impact or something like that. These are conceptual issues. You have also to make sure that you interpret your results properly. For instance, quality is not equal to citation impact. That's a very often made mistake that people consider citation impact quality, or they treat it as if it were quality. Citation impact is nothing else than a measure of the reception of published research results by the communities. Huh? Nothing else. Of course, there is a certain correlation, but primarily citation impact is not a quality measure. Okay. You should avoid arbitrariness by designing measures. So you should avoid, you should not avoid theoretical foundation and empirical evidence. So whenever you build indicators, you should first make sure that the theoretical foundation is correct, of course. And there's a very nice paper by A. Buchstein, published in '97, who noted 3 out of other dimensions to measurement that are challenges to quantitative approaches. That's a randomness, fuzziness, and ambiguity. So there's always a random error. You can cope with that. Fuzziness is a bit more tricky. For instance, fuzziness emerges if a document is assigned to different research or different subject categories. That makes it a bit fuzzy because each subject category has its own standards, and then you have to cope with different standards. Ambiguity means that you have these fuzziness from different fields you combine, so it becomes ambiguous. And on the theoretical part, indicator designers should avoid to over sophisticate. I have seen many composite indicators, and I have to say university ranking is often based on composite indicators, where different variables are combined, and these variables are very often not independent of each other, and this makes it very difficult to control these linear combinations that are underlying the composite indicator, or an oversimplification, which is ignoring essential properties. It's only focusing on one aspect and ignoring all the other aspects in research. That is also very often done, just looking at citation and ignoring all the rest, for instance. That is typical error. So basically, indicators are statistics and are subject to all the issues around statistics. So they have a tolerance level, you have to keep in mind that if you have variables that are uncorrelated, that does not mean that they are independent. I've seen quite a lot of errors in this interpretation. What is, for instance, uncorrelatedness? Or what is correlatedness, which is implying causality? It is not always implying causality. For instance, a typical example I've seen in an old study and other studies as well, if you look at download statistics, how documents are downloaded from the websites of the publishers, for instance, and you compare it, for instance, with citation rates, then you find very often a strong correlation between download statistics and citation rates. And I've seen such interpretation that, okay, yes, of course, you first download and you cite it. So there's a causality. The more downloads, the more citations as a consequence of downloads. It's not quite true. It can also be the other way around, because highly cited papers are known to the community and people are interested in these in reading these highly cited papers and downloading them. So it works in both directions. So be careful with such steps. And in addition, I have there are two conditions that needs to be observed. On one hand, most underlying frequency distributions are discrete. So publication activity, a scientist publishes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on papers. A paper receives 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 citations. These are discrete, non-negative integer value, skewed and heavy tail distribution. So you have a lot of papers uncited receiving less citation, and you have very few papers very highly cited. It's a very polarized issue you have, and that's typical of bibliometrics. The same applies to publication activity, actually, and also collaboration. So that is one issue. The other issue is the sample size, so to speak. That means you have to take care when you apply indicators that it's a statistic and you need a certain sample size. So if you have a scientist who has published 4 publications, please do not calculate any statistics, do not apply any statistics to that. You have 4 publications, you can say, okay, these 4 publications have received so many citations, that's it. Please do not make any further analysis, do not calculate any mean values, percentiles whatsoever on the basis on these 4 publications. There's no point. The random error is much too large on that. Okay. So and when you build indicators, you have to keep in mind that that the indicators you apply to research assessment, the preconditions are that it must be valid. So measure what is intended to measure. I mentioned already that impact is not equal to quality. So in citation impact measure, like average citation rate, for instance, is not a quality measure. It's not a valid quality measure. For instance, or an impact factor is not a valid measure for the performance of scientists. It must be meaningful, so that has to do with the significance of measurement. It must tell you something, provide information of what you like to measure. It's not just a number, okay? It must be reliable, it must be robust. For instance, if you change the system a bit, with minor changes, the indicators may not change largely, so that's very important. Marginal changes to the system might not result in changes of the indicators or the outcomes of the assessment. That's very important. They must be normalizable, because each subject, has its own standards. I will show you some example of that. And some of the indicators, like the H-index, you might have heard about Hirsch's H-index, which is also provided with all databases, actually with Web of Science, with Scopus, also with Google Scholar, is not normalizable, because it's based on two components of publication activity and citation impact. It must be standardizable, because you need standard indicators, because if somebody tells you, oh, I used the relative citation rate or a relative citation index, it must be clear what is meant by that, how it is built, because many institutes have used their own relative citation indices, but they are not always compatible. So you need a standard where you clearly document, my indicator looks like that, and it has that name, and if you refer to it, it has to be calculated this way and not in another way, okay? It's very important to make sure that the results are replicable. So we had already a workshop on scientific bibliometric standards in '95, already 26 years ago. Then later on, 8 years ago, we had the bibliometric evaluation standard debate in Berlin, and you might know the Leiden Manifesto that has been published 6 years ago. These are all initiatives dealing with these issues, okay? Now, we have another issue. Now I think we have the data, we have retrieved a good data set, we have selected indicators that are valid, that are robust, that can be used for the assessment of units in these around these data for which you have downloaded the data and retrieved the data, for instance. Now we have to answer the following question. How, which granularity level we should use, and maybe the unit might be a department, or it might be a university, or might be a larger institute. These are different aggregation levels, of course. And then how far go you down to the topic level? So actually you can use a proper subject classification scheme. Many databases are providing their own schemes, like Scopus or like Web of Science. There are many different versions that are independent of the databases. So Scopus has a 3-level hierarchically structured scheme. Clarivate provides a classification scheme of different granularity. It's in Insights. They use one with a database, Web of Science, the subject categories. They use one with you have an independent one by Digital Science Dimensions that is using the field of research, which is rather independent. It's a 2-level version, but actually the 4th system, the fields of research system, has more levels, but Dimensions is only using these 2 levels. So we at ACOM, we have jointly with the Budapest group, of course, we have developed a hierarchic 4-level subject classification system building on the Web of Science subject categories. The highest level is the 3 main domains: life sciences, natural and applied science, and social sciences, and humanities, 15 subject fields, 75 for disciplines, and the about 250 subject categories. This is changing from year to year. And this is how it looks like. Huh? Okay, so this is the structure of the system. We are using that for assessment exercises, for research evaluation, but also for information exercises, okay? So the granularity is important since all research communities have their own specific communication behavior, which strongly depends on the subject. So this affects, for instance, the publication type, because in the sciences, so-called hard sciences, in the sciences, they prefer to publish in research articles, in journal articles, but also in proceedings. Other communities in the social science, and notably in the humanities, publish monographs, book chapters. In economics, we often publish working papers. You have communities in law, for instance, and others, where in the arts you have catalogs, for instance, and several communities you still use loose leaf services, for instance. These are just single papers, so to speak, similar so sheets of papers that can be collected. The publication activity differs from discipline to discipline. So in experimental and the medical sciences, you have quite a lot of publications you can, or papers you can publish a year. In engineering, in mathematics, it's much less. So I'm a mathematician myself. To write a mathematical paper take a lot of time. You have to prove your theorems. It has to be reviewed. All the reviewers have to follow your proof step by step, and it takes a year till you have published a paper. Actually, in the social science and the humanities, where you have typically larger publications, larger papers, or you have book chapters or monographs, it takes also some time. The citation impact is consequently lower in mathematics and the humanities than it is in the experimental sciences, where you have more papers, where you have a faster communication. And this is also the response time. The reaction on the published paper is faster in the experimental and applied sciences than in the theoretical sciences. And of course, the co-authorship patterns differ. In mathematics, it's still typical that you have less co-authors than, for instance, extreme example is hyper-authorship in high energy physics, where you have up to several thousand co-authors in one paper. And the list of co-authors and institutions and countries is sometimes longer than the paper itself. So that's an extreme case, but in between you have a range from single authorship, still typical in mathematics and humanities, to large teams, group authorship in physics, in life sciences, for instance. And this has an effect on co-authorship patterns as well, of course. And here I show you these different fields. I have selected here some, like analytical, inorganic, nuclear chemistry, electric and electronic engineering, applied mathematics, immunology, physics of solids and pure, and applied ecology. And you see the different life curve of citations over time, actually 21 years. You see, for instance, in I5, which is immunology, you see a fast response within 2 years with a high peak and then a fast decline after that. Huh? And if you compare it, for instance, with mathematics, H1 here, the lowest one, which is quite flat, you have a small later response, but you have a higher level of citations later on. And you see fields in between. For instance, very interesting is ecology here, with all high level of citation rates, long-lasting citation impact, which is clearly contrasted by the medical field. So this is typical of disciplines and fields. And if you look at the granularity, for instance, if you collect your data with a different granularity level, like Web of Science categories, like disciplines, or like major fields, and you build indicators, you have to make sure that this had not an effect on the indicator itself. So we looked, for instance, at the subject normalized citation impact as we define it here, and we looked at 676 European universities and research institutions, and we calculated the indicators on the basis on ISI subject categories, on disciplines, and the major fields. The major fields, you remember, that is the subject classification scheme I have shown you. And if we make a regression analysis, we see that there's a strong correlation between the subject category level and the discipline level, you see the correlation coefficient is very high, close to 1. And it's a bit lower if you have a regression analysis of the larger fields, the major fields, and compared with the subject categories. And you see also a lot of outliers already here, above and also below. But very important, the slope. The slope is almost exactly 1. That means that the subject granularity has no effect on the indicator values. So it would be very bad if, for instance, this changes to 2 or something like that. That means if you change the granularity level, then also the indicator values will change considerably. And that means the assessment exercise would change, the results of the exercise would change if you apply indicators at a different granularity level. And that is not the case. It's just a problem that at a larger, higher, at the lower level of granularity, you have more outliers. And actually, you find a lot of subjects here, like geosciences that are typical here, and fields that are quite heterogeneous. Okay, so summary is low granularity is a blurred picture caused by overlap, because also the fields are overlapping. So physics and chemistry is overlapping. If you have smaller topics, they are not so overlapping anymore. It's too coarse for getting a sharp and well-defined picture, in turn often based on large samples, but the underlying samples are large. If you have a large field, also the activity of scientists in a larger field is larger than a small topic, of course, and you have more documents and you have a higher reliability, mathematically speaking. High granularity is possible multiple assignment of items, because each document, if you look at the database, any database like Web of Science, Scopus, or you look at the dimensions, each paper is assigned to several topics. That is also, that causes a certain fuzziness. And each topic has a different standard, of course, in terms of communication, of terms of activity, citation, and so on. The identification of items, their features and attributes might become difficult, yes. And based on sometimes minute samples decreasing the reliability, because if you look at the very small topics and the activity of a research group, then you have only a few publications a year, and that makes it difficult to conduct a bibliometric analysis on the basis of such small samples, okay? So the aggregation level, this is, the aggregation level is, of course, on the other hand, is the aggregation level by units. Individual scientists is micro, departments is also micro, institutions, universities is meso, and countries, for instance, or regions, world regions is macro. And Hank Mood stressed that the choice of indicators depends on the aggregation level. So you have others is other as the granularity, you have to make a choice what kind of indicators you apply to the different levels of aggregation. If you make a country-wise analysis, international comparison of research activity in countries, you need other indicators than for individual researchers. And indicators appropriate for one level are not necessarily applicable to the other one. That's according to Hank Mood. And at lower aggregation levels, researchers have become more susceptible to the consequences of bibliometric practice, then they are more and more concerned by publicly use and misuse of bibliometric methods. That means at the country and university level, you know, the university ranking exercises worldwide, it's not all universities are interested in stepping up in the ranking, of course, and they do big efforts to do so. But at the lowest level, individual scientists often feel themselves victims to evaluation, because this is a direct effect on their promotion, on their funding, based on the inclusion of bibliometric results in the evaluation. This has been observed already. Okay, and this is something I always like to show. If you apply bibliometrics, that's on the right-hand side, the green triangle or pyramid. And you should combine it with qualitative exercises based on expert opinion or peer evaluation, which is here indicated by the blue one. So at the country level, you are fine with bibliometrics, and it's very hard to make a proper peer evaluation based on the country level, because the peers have to read all the 100,000 millions of publications. That's impossible. Huh? On the other hand, if you go down to the meso level, university, disciplines, journals, then departments or research group, it's already micro level, individuals, then you are not fine with bibliometrics anymore. You have small sample sizes, and you have other aspects in the evaluation of individuals or research groups, and you need more and more peer evaluation, expert opinion. And it's easier because the number of documents, the number of activities, the scope of activities is allows an individual assessment by peers, by experts. So here the evaluations should focus more on qualitative assessment than of bibliometrics. Bibliometrics here at this part should only complement the qualitative one. Here at the macro level, it could be otherwise, the other way around. Okay. The soundness and validity of methods is also more necessary at the individual level. So you make any mistake at the individual level. One missed paper that might be highly cited can compromise your bibliometric study that is used in the context of evaluation of individual scientists. So we have recommended to use individual level bibliometrics only in combination with qualitative methods and on the basis of the qualitative research portfolio. That's very, very important. So the profile includes, you have to have a look at the profile of individual scientists. And even if you have a similar profile, just imagine you have two professors of the same seniority, but one professor is a research professor, so to speak, with a focus on research, who has a lot of publications and can devote a lot of time on research. And on the other hand, you might have a professor in a school, like a business school, and with a lot of teaching and administration duties, with less time for research. So even in the same topic, you have differences in the profile of the two persons, and you have to take into account this particular profile. And it also applies to senior scientists or to PIs or to junior scientists. If a scientist is more devoted to administration or to technical issues or to education, that is certainly to the detriment of the time used to do and to conduct research. And this is also one point. And on the other hand, of course, there's no point in comparing the activities of a junior professor with a senior professor and so on. So this is all part of this research portfolio you have to take into account, and you need additional qualitative assessment methods to get a complete picture, and we have formulated some recommendation on how to cope with that. So far so good. If I still have some time, I would go a bit further. I hope it was, I confess it was a lot of stuff very compressed into some slides. I have many examples. I can provide many papers on that. We have published jointly. I have many presentations, maybe even online, on parts of those where you find more explanation on that. Also on the very important issue, how to clean data, how to process data. We call that pre-bibliometric data processing, how to make data fit to use. Also to the different standards in different fields where you can really compare and see how dramatic, even this in physics, it is a field like physics or chemistry, the different, you have mathematical physics, you have physics of condensed matters, particles and fields, for instance, with different standards in terms of collaboration, in terms of publication activity and citation. And you might not apply a granularity where you put them all together, because you might harm the persons who are subject to evaluation if you combine or simply apply the same standards to different profiles, so to speak. Now, coming to a very new topic, that is now what we have measured is in terms of scholarly communication. Citation impact we measure in the databases is citation impact based on citation in scientific publications, in scientific journals, in books, proceedings, and so on. But now we can also have a look beyond scholarly communication. What is meant by that? Scientific communication in a broader context. For instance, citations or reception of scientific literature by the public, by science policy, by practical guidebooks, for instance. How is, for instance, medical literature implemented in medical guidebooks? That is not covered by the databases. Also, policy citation is not covered by bibliographic databases. This is something that is also an important impact of research, but it is not covered cannot be covered by public bibliographic databases. So these are the essential limitations of what I call scientometrics 1.x. That is scholarly communication. Various limitations have been largely discussed already by Glens and Bakere. So most of them are methodology, technical nature, and concern the use of application of results and indicators. We have discussed that shortly here today. Most general and conceptual limitations are due to the focus on scholarly communication. That is exactly what I meant now. But you have also web-based data sources that go behind that framework. For instance, Google Scholar is already going behind that and what they call web matrix. And there was a small-scale study by Hoffman et al. In 2014 who observed that no correlation of online communication activity with any of the other established impact measures is observed. That is very important to see. So what can be done then if we would like to go beyond scholarly communication? So, and here we have a big step towards the measurement of societal impact and broader impact of research is to cover open science. You know what is covered by open science? It's a movement actually. Open science covers open access, open reviewing, open data, open all these issues are also citizen science is part of open science. That means that not only scientists working at the established institutions are doing science, but also citizens can be included. And for some fields, it's quite important. For instance, in zoology, in biology, in astrophysics and astronomy, where you can make your own observation and you can share your observations, where you travel, where you find new life forms, and you can contribute to that. These are all typical fields, but also social sciences is subject to citizen science. Other fields that require specific equipment are rather not suited for that. Okay. And social media metrics or alternative metrics can be used as a groundwork and components for Scientometrics 2.0 that has been introduced by Preem in 2010. And he recommended, for instance, bookmarking, reference managers, recommendation systems, comments on articles, microblogging, Wikipedia, blogging, and other sources like social networks, video, and open data repositories to look at what is the response, how is the reception of scientific literature in this framework, in these sources. Okay, there are big promises, of course. Cassidy Tsuchimoto pointed to the increasing demand for showing impact of research beyond academia, also in terms of democratizing the impact by giving greater voice and vote, for instance, to underrepresented groups, like in terms of gender, ethnicity, disability, geographicity, and in determining impact, because there is still a certain limitation in getting your paper published. So it's still to the detriment to not so developed countries to get access to important journal, high impact journals, even to pay the APCs for open access is a problem sometimes. So there is an inequality still going on in the traditional publication and communication channels, but the web is more democratic as such, so it gives a greater voice to those who are otherwise underrepresented. The other main promise of Cytometrics 2.1 comes from social networks. And this goes also back to Hoffman. Network-based approaches based on social media data may also contribute to a more diversified system of scientific impact assessment by adding a relational and social capital-based perspective. Quite interesting. Now, a concrete example. So I'm using now PlumX metrics. You might know ALP-metric and PlumX metrics by the other services already. And here they define, I'm using that as a passport total. They define separate categories. They use to calculate the metrics. One is the usage. That's typically, I mentioned already, the download statistics, the views, the clicks, library holdings, video plays, for instance, is usage. Now I have to say, I organized it this way. Now we have a problem with this matrix. I come to that, but I know we discussed it already. Because if you look at the publication activity, citation impact, so you exactly know who the users of scientific informations are in terms of citation impact. You know exactly who is citing a paper by whom. The citing paper has a name, an author has an address, an affiliation, and also the cited one has a name and an affiliation address. Okay, very clear. Now, the purpose is also clear. It's explained in the paper. You cite the paper because the information provided in the cited paper is used in the current research you are publishing, and you used it for that and that purpose. Even if you just mention that there is literature, similar literature on this topic, please refer to that. It's also an indication of the use of information. Now, usage statistics as downloads, or look at the Web of Science usage, there is a usage indicator as well, does not tell you anything about the identity of user. You do not know who's using, you have a statistic, but you do not know who's using that. And you do not know why. Citation, quite clear. The purpose is clear in the framework of scholarly communication. Usage might be quite diverse. You might use this because you might download the paper because you need it for your own research, but only because you are interested in reading that. It's not sure that you read it at all. After all, I've downloaded a lot of papers because I found the title and the abstract interesting. I looked at the paper and was disappointed, so I dropped it. Or it might be for education. Students might download the paper because they might need it for their studies. It does not necessarily mean that it is part of scientific communication anymore. Captures. This is bookmark code for reader. That's, for instance, readers is very important, like Mendeley, for instance. It tells you more about the use. It specifies already the kind of use and also something about the purpose and the user without giving clear identity, but it's practically useful. You know who is has subscribed to Mendeley, for instance. You have more information on that. The mentions, that blog posts, comments, reviews, Wikipedia links, media, news media. It's already content related now. The first two are not really content related. This is content related already. It's mentioned. It tells something about the relationship with the content. Social media, of course, like Facebook, tweets is more specific. You have also information about the tweeters, about identities. But of course, as compared with citation, it's still quite poor. If you look at tweets, for instance, yeah, the information in tweets is sometimes not very informative, so to speak. It's just referring, there is a paper published there, some like quite interesting, but nothing particular. which also retweets, more important that retweets, you know what a retweet is a tweet that is forwarded, so to speak, is referred to. And citations is also part of these metrics, but a broader spectrum of citations, not only in scientific literature, but also in clinical or policy citation context, like citation indexes, of course, patent citation, also patents in clinical citations, I mentioned already, policy citations. These are all part of that. And here again, we are back to the traditional information we have also in the databases. Here we exactly know, so to speak, what the background of citation is and who the users are and what the used information is actually used for. Okay. Just to show you, we made a lot of regression analysis between downloads, between several of these services like Mendeley. I mentioned the caption, the Crossref citation, Scopus citation, Web of Science citation, EBSCO service, and Web of Science usage statistics. Also, Mike Selver was very active, and he found that Mendeley readership can be used as an early impact indicator, and has that is one of the few indicators in altmetrics that are really useful in an evaluative context. But if you look here at the figures, you see really there's not always a strong correlation, and that's good. If there's always a strong correlation, for instance, between usage and impact, or between capture and impact, or social media and impact, then it would be very bad. Then you just use one indicator and that is sufficient for all. That's very good that they are complementing each other. They are providing complementary information. So this is something in new direction, actually. I just want to give some last interpretation and significance of altmetrics. The context of altmetrics is even more important for the interpretation of the measures. So that's very important, because we have a lot of these altmetric non-scholarly reception, but it's so diverse that you really need to know the context. Okay, usage metric reveal little about motivation. I mentioned that already. Social media metrics are heterogeneous and partly just express acknowledgements and simple comments. Altmetrics are more prone to inflationary effects than traditional bibliometrics. There's kind of inflation. It's also based on the databases. There is a Latin American Cielo database, and if you include that, you have quite a lot of discussion of several issues, because it's also done in the public. And there are a lot of medical issues, notably now around COVID-19, which is discussed by many people, and there this is boosting, so to speak, the indicators you can calculate on that. So we have found, for instance, on special medical issues, a larger social impact, so to speak, in Latin America than in the US, because of the data, because of the inclusion of the database. Okay. So there are a lot of challenges and limitations. So further challenges and limitations have been summarized by Sugimoto again, Kumpelberg et al. So the problem is that the analysis is usually conducted at the individual micro level. So if you look at altmetrics, plumix, you have these DUNAT, or you have these nice tools which gives you an indication with different colors, what the components, the 5 components, for instance, are. And you have a composite indicator at the end, which gives you an indication of the altmetrics based on the different aspects. But it's a micro level. It's very hard to aggregate it. And it's it's difficult to assign this to institutions, to departments, which makes it very difficult to make comparative study based on these indicators. So large-scale studies are one of the main challenges. The validity, reliability, and feasibility is here the question. And the high dynamics and rapid development of online and electronic communication is a challenge, because Now, once these indicators become established, they might be already outdated. The development is so fast with new tools you have, with new platforms you can include, that the yesterday data might be already outdated. We made an exercise based on Google Scholar. It was still a more traditional one. We looked at data. We collected about, on one paper, we had some 80 citations in different contexts and on different platforms. 1 week later, we had more than 130. Not because it was cited so fast between a couple of days. No, because a new repository was open, so to speak, and they added. So it's an open universe. It's an open universe. The web is an open universe. The traditional databases are closed universe. They have index data. They report about their indexation. You can compare after years, because you can replicate everything on the web. Replication is practically impossible because the web is changing so fast that the data you collect, you retrieve today, are obsolete tomorrow. And Mike Salvor has done an exercise where he has done it day by day and documented the status quo day by day. It's the data made available day by day so that you can really replicate it. But this is really a challenge. So further ones is, in this context, we have to point to conceptual and theoretical issues again. So on the conceptual part, metrics developers indicated as a use guarantee replicability and robustness. That is the challenge I just mentioned. Guarantee commensurability. That's also a point. If you use altmetric data from altmetric or from plumx, how to compare them? They're differently structured. You pay attention to the interpretation of metrics, how to interpret these donuts, for instance. Avoid arbitrariness in designing measures. That's the point. They say that they build composite indicators, they round numbers, and this is a bit, a question in how far this is arbitrary and what's the effect on their indicators. And last not least, and here I'm almost to complete, is that many assumptions are not yet validated and tested, and there are no clear definition of actors on both sides. So impact upon whom? That was a question addressed by Cassidy Tsuchimoto. It's not clear in altmetrics, impact on whom. So in traditional bibliometrics, you can see impact on whom. You see exactly the impact. What is the impact of research done in one field on research done in another field? You can trace it by citations. By one research group on the research done by another research group or another university, another country. We can speak about information flow, information transfer across fields, across entities and units. It has been done in scientific. Here, we do not know. We are a bit in the dark. We see there is a certain impact. We can even measure it, but we do not clearly know on both sides. There are some statistics provided by plumx, by altmetrics, where you can see, for instance, who are the users, for instance, but it's incomplete. It's only a small part. Is it from libraries? Is it from other scholars? Is it more public? But there are no clean data on that, and it's only a small share of data that is indicated, so it does not allow conclusions. Data quality, the sources, reliably input and assignment. How can we assign the data to the units we need for a proper assessment? The results are automatic processes. They produce a lot of errors and influence social media metrics. That's a point that it's highly error prone. So classification of users proved highly error prone as well. Lacking mathematical background and interpretation. Here we do not know citation processes, publication activity. We have mathematical models for information transfer. We have stochastic processes we can use as a model, burst process, and so on. It's very, we have a very nice and well-developed mathematical background on that. Here we do not know. We have one particular model that is zero inflation, that data are zero inflated, but there's also an explanation. Why are documents often not downloaded? Why is the zero download inflated? Because no full document, no full text document is available. If it is not available, it cannot be downloaded. So there are many question marks here. And finally, the issue of the composite indicators and arbitrariness of measures I mentioned already. And of course, the effect of open access variance is insufficiently measurable. So that's an issue in traditional bibliometrics. Open access is documented. You know about gold open access, you know about green open access, you know about other forms of open access, be it diamond or bronze or whatsoever, and you can measure it, and you can also measure the impact of that. Here it is a bit more tricky. So published studies are partially reporting contradictory observations. So I have collected some examples, and also the possible effect of predatory open access, the so-called predatory on future publication cultures, is not yet sufficiently known. So we do not know if there is a sustainability of this effect of, not a good sustainability effect of the so-called predatory open access publication. And finally, there is a comment by Van Noorten. It's already 7 years ago, but it still holds a bit. Some analysts argue that despite their millions of users, massive social academic network sites have not yet proven their essential worth. So, and here I stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear professors, thank you very much for the great presentations. I myself have never done a bibliometric study before, and so I learned a lot from your training session today. I also believe that other participants also benefit from your presentations, and therefore there may be some questions.
Yep.
Right? So now is the time for our Q&A sessions. I think we have around like 30 minutes for the Q&A. Yep. So now because there's a lot of participants, so if anyone have a question, please use the function raise hand so we can see you. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So Khánh Hoàng, I have a question to Professor Wolfgang about his presentation today. So could I ask the question?
Please.
Yeah, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, yeah, Professor Wolfgang. Actually, this is the first time I learned from this topic in my life. So very academic and also very practical and very useful. Actually, I have actually you have 2 points I would like to ask. The first one, you mentioned about the quality of data.
Yep.
And the quality of data should be related to different stakeholders. I concerned about the data producer. So currently in the world, there are so many database producer. So how much we should believe them? How much we should believe them, and which ways we should believe them? That's the first question. The second question that in Vietnam and also in my universities, we like to ask our lecturers to find out the new research trends. So we right now we mostly based on Web of Science database, and you already mentioned that we can use bibliometric approaches to evaluate emerging topics. So for doing so, which efficient ways should we follow? Right. So I have 2 questions concerned about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, the question in how far we can believe. So most databases are commercial databases. They are products you have to subscribe for, you have to pay for. And that's also, you can understand it because building such a database requires a lot of investment, of course. You have to collect the data, you have to provide the database, you have to maintain the database, you have, yeah. In how far it is reliable and how far you can believe. Now, on one hand, you have different databases and you can compare them. So this already gives an indication if you see that the data are more or less the same, then or coincide. That is an indication that it's correct. But usually it's the user. So it's clearly documented. So the data are collected from the official sources, from the publishers of the journals, the proceedings, and the books. On the other hand, and this is also an exercise why I say we need to clean the data. For instance, at the departmental level, we match the databases with our own publication data, with our CVs we have taken from the CVs, and then it turns out where we can find errors. Okay, there's of course one point you have raised in terms of how far can we can believe, that's the citations. Huh? The number of citations, is that always correct? So the bibliographic data are in principle correct. There are errors, but you can believe it. Huh? The citations is something different because this is calculated by them. And just to tell you how it's calculated, it's based on the references. So, and this is also a point where we always have counted our own citations. You take the citation list, you look at the reference list. You have a moment. Maybe I can show you this. I have just a moment. Doesn't matter. It's hard to find now. So if you download an individual the data, metadata from an individual document from the database, you find all the entries, their author name, the affiliation, the abstract, and so on, funding information, the title, of course, and you find the reference list. And in the reference list, you find all the cited references. You can check, of course. These are just the list as you find them in the documents. And you can take one item of it, and you can really find it as a source, and then you can look up this source in the database, and then you see the original document becomes the citing one, and you just count those for each item in the reference list. So you can validate it and you can check it. So, and we can say there are errors, but usually the databases are reliable. There is some information that is not really reliable. That is that they have already modified on the large scale. For instance, there are options like organization enhanced, which is error prone. Usually it works, but there is a lot of unclean data in it. So you are always better off if you clean your data yourself. So as a groundwork, you can believe them because it's validated. You have different sources. You can compare with each other, and it has been done, and people came up with the same results, so to speak. And this is a validation, an indication that the data are more or less correct. With the errors, you can partially correct. The second question was, excuse me, I forgot it now.
So actually, if we use the databases, different sources to evaluate about emerging topics, for example.
Yep.
And then we can recognize fully about new research trend in the world.
Yep.
Then we can encourage our academic staff to follow.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Now, once again, I would say there are some shortcomings of each database. That's the coverage. The coverage is a bit problematic in Web of Science for the humanities, especially, but also for this applies to other databases as well. This has to do that people are not, researchers in humanities are not really publishing in journal articles, mainly books. They have other outputs. that are not covered in bibliographic database. So that's one point. No, you are right. So the problem and the advantage of these databases is the network analysis. So each individual document and each scientist who has published in the database is a vertex, is a node in the network. So documents can be connected via networks with other documents, by citations, for instance, or by text similarity. Yeah? They have the same similar text as another one. And by these networks, you can use this network to identify new emerging clusters in it. And this is what we have done. So you can cluster this space based on citation links or textual links. And then you find, if you look at the evolution, that new clusters are emerging that are linked to other clusters, but are quite new in terms of content. These are emerging topics. So there are some criteria when you can consider a topic an emerging one. We have also formulated that. We have published on that literature. But the network analysis is an important, this mapping of sites is an important standard issue in bibliometric research. But also here, the data source must be clean. So because I have seen maps where I found, for instance, a network analysis, it was a collaboration network or something like that, where I found the same university on one end here as X university and on the other university X. Because of the name variants, you have to clean it up because otherwise you get nonsense results. Yeah? That's also very important in network analysis. Okay, I hope this was an answer.
Thank you very much. Yes, that is clear. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Please, the next participant, Nguyễn, please.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation. Actually, I really enjoy your presentation because recently I do a lot of bibliometric analysis. So I have a few questions. First one is usually in order to have a more reliable result, I combine and also I contrast multiple data to get the result. And after that, I will compare between them. So it will show a lot of scenario. So for example, like we will have a conflict or different result. So how should we deal with those situations? Because in some case, when I reduce, for example, the number of result, so it's I afraid that it will impact on the research finding. That's my question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if I got it. So you have an exercise, an assessment exercise or bibliometric exercise, and you have different scenarios, and they are different.
Yeah. So for example, I use the clever analysis, and also I use dimension database to do the analysis. So when I compare, the result will be different. So I have to like compare and contrast among them in order to see the similar trending among the database I have.
Yes. Yeah, I understand now the question. I understand. So the problem is, of course, you have different sources. On larger levels of aggregation, that should not be a problem because there are a lot of exercises and studies published that, for instance, Scopus and Web of Science provide more or less the same indicator values on the larger levels. On a lower level, it's not quite sure because of the coverage. There are documents that are missing in one database but are present in the other database. And if you have a person with only a couple of numbers, 10 papers or something like that, that you might have a different coverage and consequently also different outcomes. That's one point. The second point is if you apply the tools that are provided and publicly available, they are based on different methodologies. And this might indeed result in different outcomes and indicator values. That's the problem. You have, yeah, I understand. This makes it quite difficult because they apply different techniques, and if you apply different techniques, you might have a different, yeah, some biases in it. Yeah, this is a point we should talk about, because I need to know the concrete case, because, for instance, there are a lot of, you can apply, for instance, the WOS viewer provided by CWTS for your mapping of science. You can use site spaces. You can use bibliometrics, which is provided in the R environment, and they are all offering different approaches. And this is what I mean. You should aim at commensurable things, because it's also the case we had earlier. If you calculate indicators, you need exactly to use the same subject, the same time frame for citation and publication. Otherwise, you get necessarily different values. So you need the same data set and the same methodology to get the same results. But if you have questions, maybe the organizers can provide you my email address, and you send me your example and I can have a look at it. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Trâm Nghĩa, for your questions. Next, please, Mr. Hiệp Hùng Phạm, please.
Thank you, Professor, for your comprehensive presentation. I have 2 questions for you. I also have experiences in conducting bibliometric analysis, and recently I submit some bibliometric manuscript to several journals. And what made me surprised is that I received some very mixed feedback from the editor. Some editor appreciate the approach of bibliometric analysis. However, some editor feedback with negative. They don't appreciate the bibliometric analysis. They said that it's just a descriptive, descriptive, and you need to work harder to make it more insightful. And my question is that as the editor-in-chief of Centrometric, can you give me some advice how to make my bibliometric analysis more sophisticated, more insightful? This is my first question.
Yep.
And my second question is that I find out that there are 3 types of review paper. The first one is bibliometric. The second one is meta-analysis, right? And the third one is something like review paper written by a top professor or guru. He or she don't download the data as similar to bibliometric or meta-analysis. He or she just write a very long article and put some argument. But I found it's also very interesting because it's written by top professor. And my second question is that, in your point of view, what is the pros and cons of bibliometric analysis compared with meta-analysis and compared with qualitative review paper written by a top professor? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. The first question, it is due to the scope of the journal. So, for instance, Cytometrics is basically accepting methodological papers. So, this is strong methodological background that is contributing to the advancement of the field. So, we usually do not accept case studies or just testing these studies kind of systematic literature review or something like that. You might publish such a study or submit it to a specific journal on that topic. They are often interested in receiving such statistics on what's going on in their field. That's very important to the scientists who are, to the readership who are reading this journal, that they know actually what is hot in this field, what is done in this field, who are the actors, what should I read, and so on. But it's typically not interesting for the readership of scientometrics. Huh? They are not familiar with this with the topic. So if you look at topics like alcohol misuse, or I do not know, or wastewater research, that's not interesting for the readership of scientometrics unless this topic is used to develop some new methods for bibliometrics. And then we can accept it. Huh? So that's the point. I think that's a very simple answer on this question, but that's actually what's about. The second one, that's more tricky. What is kind of review? I mentioned also review. But review means actually that's a document type. That means review literature is summarizing the research in a certain topic. Huh? That's a typical, but it's also a methodological paper. It's not designed to submit it to scientometrics. You can write a good review article in all fields. But what you mean is a kind of review like this qualitative and saying, giving comments and sometimes critical comments on specific articles published in a field, huh? Like in scientometrics or other fields. This is important, but this is, of course, this is kind of letter to the editor. I would we accept such comments as letter to the editors. We publish it, and of course, that's also the point. It can be bibliometric. It can be, of course, really a qualitative saying I have problems with the conceptual background of this paper. I have problems with the coverage of this paper. It is only partial, it's biased, it is overdoing part of that. It might happen. That's really a qualitative assessment of a paper, and it can be brought forward, of course, and usually we publish it and we give the author of the study that is under criticism the chance to answer to it, to give a response to these things. But it's not so typical. Of course, you can also question results by using alternative statistics or alternative methodological approaches. Then it's not a qualitative, it's a quantitative approach, so to speak. So that's also possible, and it also happens. Yeah? I do not know if this is an answer to your question.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, okay.
All right, thank you very much for your questions, and for Professor Wolfgang Glanzel detailed answers. And now next, I would like to invite Mr. Dũng Nguyễn for his question, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, professors, and thank you, Khánh Hoàng, for introducing me to asking more questions. I would like to have two questions from a researcher's perspective. My first question, currently a researcher is facing with different literature approaches. For example, traditional literature review, meta-analysis, content analysis, or even very fashionable systematic literature review, and now bibliometric reviews. So from your point of view, what kind of literature review approach you think is the best for researchers to review literatures? And of course, because you were presenting bibliometrics, and you think that this approach is very good, but in which specific context, which literature review approach is better? This is my first question. And my second question, in your last slides, you also gave a note that when we use the bibliometric indicators, we have to be careful because of some challenges or issues nowadays. For example, self-citation by the authors, the significant increase of predatory open access, and also the disadvantages of impact factors. So from your perspective, which very important bibliometric indicators researchers should focus on when reviewing literature review? So that's all for my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. It seems that in your community, literature review is a very important issue. It is indeed. I cannot give a clear answer what's the best. There is no best. So it depends on the scope or on the purpose. A traditional literature review is very important to the community. This is done by experts who are active themselves in the field of the topic in question, and are expert in that, and can also clearly classify, can group research around topics, can point to developments, can criticize, can highlight. That's very important. And the bibliometric, the so-called bibliometric reviews is I would call it a supplement to that, because you get important statistics on that, because and it's also my question, why bibliometrics? Is the metrics because you have a huge amount of documents you have to review, and as soon as you get a certain number of documents you have to deal with, it's very useful to add some statistics on that. It's not only the number, it's also the relationship between. That is a very important supplement that has been found out already by Jean Garfield. I mentioned in the very beginning with the Atlas of Science. In a traditional review, you have a summary, you have a characteristic on the literature, on the topics you cover, but the bibliometrics give still the perspective that there are now links between otherwise different subtopics. Okay, this is something that can be added. It goes back to the networks and to the emerging fields, for instance. That's the same principle actually. And here bibliometrics can really add something to that, to analyze the structure in the discipline or the topic that is otherwise reviewed even by traditional means. So that was your first question. The second question was, I forgot it already, sorry.
My second question is about the very important bibliometrics indicators researchers should focus on, because you know that there are current challenges like self-citation by the authors, or the significant increase of predatory open access databases, or even the disadvantages of impact factors. So from your point of view, so which bibliometric indicators very important to researchers focus on when they review literature?
Yeah, I would not say that there's an increase on predatory open access, but there is predatory open access. It's still an issue. And the question is there a long-lasting or impact of this predatory open access? In terms of traditional bibliometrics, it's easy to check. You can see where this material, this document is cited. You can completely find it, but in the alt matrix, it's very difficult because you do not always know who the users are. You just see that something is happening, but you do not see anything about the effect. You can trace information flows in traditional bibliometrics very nicely. One paper is citing another one, and the citing paper is again cited by another one, and you see the network, how this how this process is branching in different generations of citing papers. You can trace it, you can exactly trace it on the web. It becomes more and more difficult, and that was actually what I meant by that, that we do not know what the effects of certain things. Yeah, predatory open access was just one example here, how these effects can be captured, so to speak. how did I call it? Yeah, how is the effect on publication cultures in the future if you have some negative effects? This is not known because this remains more or less a bit in the dark. I do not know if this is a sufficient answer, but it's what I can say at the moment.
Okay, thank you. But could I back to your first questions?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned about the advantage of a bibliometrics review approach. It is using the statistical methods, but it might be thing of meta-analysis is also very closely related literature review approach. So what about your opinion between the bibliometrics review and meta-analysis review? Thank you.
Yeah, it's both important, but it's simply not the same. So you can say bibliometry is also kind of meta-analysis, yeah, but it's not the traditional meta-analysis. It's a statistic,
okay,
statistics-based and the network-based meta-analysis, so to speak.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. So I don't see any other questions. So thank you, Professor Gang Glanzel, for your sharing your knowledge and very informative responses to the participant questions. I believe that would add significantly to our understanding and practices in the bibliometrics studies. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to next. I would like to introduce Dr. Nguyễn from Lincoln University on behalf of the ACBES organizations committees to give a short speech to conclude the workshop.
Okay, thank you, Khánh Hoa. Good afternoon, Professor Wolfgang Glenzels, Professor Nguyễn Trung Phong, Professor Sư Đình Thành, Professor Nguyễn Trọng Hoài, and Dr. Bùi Quang Hùng. Good afternoon to our distinguished guests and participants in today's workshops. Once again, I'm Nguyễn, I'm from Lincoln University. My thanks goes to ACBES Organizing Committee for giving me this opportunity to present the vote of thanks to Professor Wolfgang Glenzels. I would like to thank our guest lecturers, Professor Wolfgang Glenzels today, for enlightening us with his knowledge on building bibliometrics indicators. So I think today's talks was full of knowledge and interesting things on how to build reliable bibliometric indicators for measuring research performance, and I think it's give deep insight into the topics and also reveal some interesting facts. So for example, the most important things for the bibliometrics indicators are the database, right? As well as the qualities and cleanness of data. And interestingly, you see that social media metrics, also included when it comes to research impact. So I'm pretty sure that the precious knowledge that Professor Glenzels give us today will definitely help us in building our research impacts and performance. You can start blogging or posting your research results on Facebook or Twitter, right? Yeah, that might be a very good idea. So once again, I would like to thank Professor Glenzels for taking out his time from his busy schedule and enlightening us with the knowledge on bibliometric indicators. Thank you so much once again. And also I would like to thank our supporting team that's worked very hard to make this workshop successful. And, special thanks to all participants and distinguished guest for the workshop today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, Professor Glanzels and Dr. Kuo and Nguyễn. Now I believe that is the end of the workshop. Before you leave, I would like to invite everyone to turn on your cameras so we can capture the screen for a record of our memorial workshops. And yeah, please. Thank you. All right, so the support team, please pause the recording, and now we can take, you know, can wait for the screenshot to take a screenshot with everyone here. Can everyone give a big smile, please? All right. Thank you. I believe that we are getting there at the end of the workshop. And ladies and gentlemen, please note that the next workshop will start at 6 p.m. Vietnamese time with the presentation of Professor Scott Cunningham. And so I would like to give you our great thank yous, and we'll see you there. Goodbye.